Hi, welcome to the Anti-Racial Podcast. My name is Tran, and I'm here with
Max Brawl.
Juan Sandoval.
And Alejandra Lopez.
We have a lot to talk about today. Today we are going to talk about arrests mostly on Latinos, African Americans, and whites. Race is an important topic that needs to be talked about since there have been many issues in our criminal justice systems. The different topics that we're going to talk about are arrests among race, racial disparities, and also a poker game analogy. When it comes to race, there has been a problem that happened since the pandemic and COVID.
Yeah, I agree. And with our current situation that heavily focuses on race and racism in this country, I feel it's very important for us to really dive deep into these topics.
The first topic we will be discussing are the issues made among arrests among Latinos and African Americans. Let's get started.
So if you didn't know already, the arrest rates of African Americans and Latinos are greatly higher than whites.
Yes, exactly. According to the U.S. News Report, the racial makeup of America's prisons are the following. So Black Americans are incarcerated at a state average of 1,240 per 100,000 residents, whereas Latino Americans are imprisoned at a rate of 349 per 100,000 residents. White non-Latino Americans, meanwhile, are incarcerated at 261 per 100,000 residents.
And I just want to continue the point that you just made, Juan. And according to the ACLU reports, while the U.S. only makes up 5% of the world's population, nearly 25% of the world's prison population is from the United States alone. And the ACLU also states that 1 in 3 African American men will be locked up in their life, and for Latinos this ratio is a 1-6, and this unfortunately differs greatly from whites, where this ratio is 1 in 17. And throughout the past 10 years, the U.S. prison population has continued to increase by 700%, and there are also twice as many people sitting in local jails awaiting trial and presumed innocent than the entire federal prison system.
Yeah, this really actually goes to show how people of color get treated compared to whites.
Yeah, definitely. And it's due to the fact police will target Black and Latino communities compared to white communities.
I heard in a scholarly article called Producing Race Disparity, a study on drug arrests across places and race by Shatira Gasson, explains that African Americans are already presenting themselves when it comes to experience arrest and misconduct, physical force, and even disrespected by the police officers. With these stats, it's showing there's a big problem on how race can influence police officers on arrest.
I think we can all agree that George Floyd's case is very much an example of an unfair arrest that occurred in May 2020. I'll be giving a backstory of what occurred during this terrible arrest and have us discuss what went wrong during his arrest. This backstory source was taken from the New York Times. So on May 25, Minneapolis police officers arrested George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, after a convenience store employee called 911 and told the police that Mr. Floyd had bought cigarettes with a counterfeit $20 bill. 17 minutes after, the first squad car arrived at the scene, and Mr. Floyd was unconscious pinned beneath 3 police officers showing no signs of life.
Now, just adding a little bit more detail to the incident, bystanders stated that 2 Minneapolis police officers had their knees on Floyd's neck. But even worse, cell phone video revealed people telling the officers and pleading to them, asserting that Floyd was unconscious. But unfortunately, not one of the officers that was there at the scene listened to them, and unfortunately, George Floyd lost his life. And the Minneapolis Police Department asserted that they put a knee on his neck to restrain him because they claimed that Floyd was fighting back.
Right here, I do want to add, immediately, a red flag. I mean, we have 2 Minneapolis law enforcement officers on his neck, and, they could have approached this a bit differently, he lost his life.
Yeah, definitely.
And referring back to the New York Times article, the video shows officers taking a series of actions that violated the police of Minneapolis Police Department and turned fatal, leaving Mr. Floyd unable to breathe even as he and onlookers called out for help.
Also relating to this issue of being arrested, have you guys heard about the case about Ryan Rittenhouse?
Yes, actually.
Yeah.
Anyways, according to the New York Times article called Tracking the Suspect in the Fatal Shooting, explains that in the August of last year, Kyle Rittenhouse was at a protest in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he was carrying a semi-auto rifle where he shot 3 people due to self-defense. He then was arrested and charged with first-degree intentional homicide. Recently, during his trial, he was found not guilty of the crime, which got many people frustrated. Many people believe that they have different opinions on this case on whether or not he was using self-defense. I just found out in another article that Kyle would have been charged for a serious crime if he was convicted in first-degree murder. If he was found guilty, he could have sentenced to 60 or more years in prison.
Right. You know, it actually makes me wonder why a 17-year-old had his hands on a semi-automatic gun.
I also want to know, where did he got that semi-auto weapon from? And if that person should be responsible for giving a 17-year-old a gun.
And, I was reading the New York Times article, he stated that Rittenhouse had returned to his home in Antioch, Illinois, and after the shooting. So he was then arrested after the morning of the shooting, and he was held in juvenile detention facility in Lake County, Illinois.
Using these examples of arrests reveals that a big issue with both criminal justice system and race. Kyle Rittenhouse, who's a 17-year-old kid at the time, might have committed a crime and not found guilty, while George Floyd, who was innocent, died because of a police officer trying to arrest him for something he didn't do.
And I think it's important to know that officers never shot Rittenhouse, even though he had a semi-automatic rifle on him. And if we're looking at the other side of the story, there's stories of unarmed African-American men that are shot by officers just by holding something, and I feel that's a stark contrast between the two cases.
And this is apparent in Rittenhouse case, this becomes a race issue. And he posed a threat to the protesters, and yet law enforcement officers didn't stop him. CNN reported that Isaiah Brown, an unarmed man, was shot by Virginia Sheriff's deputy about an hour after the same deputy gave the man a ride. Brown was shot while on the phone with 911 after a deputy who had returned to respond to a domestic incident per state policy mistook a phone for a gun. Brown was taken to a local hospital after the shooting early Wednesday with serious but not life-threatening, according to statements that Virginia State Police. And I think that this kind of relates to what Matt had mentioned earlier. There's a contrast between a black man unarmed and Rittenhouse.
This is another case that's unfortunately an African American gets shot by law enforcement officer due to mistaking for being armed, and in this case, Brown was unarmed.
And you would think, after the Trayvon Martin case, back in 2012, that this wouldn't happen again. But surely enough, cases like George Floyd and Isaiah Brown still occurred.
It makes me wonder if there are many similar cases to Trayvon Martin's and Isaiah Brown are out there, and that have not been broadcast in the news.
No, this is a great example, that the criminal justice is flawed and policies are to be reformed to prevent cases like George Floyd from happening. Many law enforcement officers hold little accountability when they charge with in-line of duty shootings.
Yeah, and many law enforcement officers gets away with murder and hold no responsible for their action. However, this is also apparent with other forms of abuse in the workforce.
And I just want to add, police brutality is also a common thing to hear about now.
Mm-hmm.
And especially from things as little as police reports and traffic stops to as large as a mass protest or a riot. I feel another high-profile case of police brutality has to be the 1991 Rodney King case. And if you guys haven't heard about that, it's this is from the History Channel. Rodney King was beaten severely after leading police on an 8-mile pursuit. King, who was intoxicated, was not really listening to officers in the sense that he was intoxicated. However, he was shot twice with a taser and started fighting back. King testified, stating that the officers said, "We are going to kill you," and finished that phrase with a racial slur. So King was beaten by officers with the baton on his head and chest for roughly 50 seconds. And even though he laid prone, one of the officers proceeded to step on his neck and another kick King on his neck 6 times.
It's hard, to imagine what fear and pain Rodney felt through that experience, because I've seen that video and, it's really bad.
Yeah, definitely. I feel that this is just a small case that embodies the entire history of racial injustice in America. If you didn't know, the first police force in America were slave patrols. So it's safe for me to assume that this racist rhetoric towards people of color has continued through multiple generations.
Also, with many cases like this, no one should experience like this kind of pain that these officers did to them.
Additionally, can we talk about the shooting of Jacob Blake? When Jacob Blake's shooting was the incident that started the Kenosha protests, which Kyle Rittenhouse ended up killing 2 people. So Jacob Blake was a 29-year-old African-American male who was left partially paralyzed after being shot 7 times by Kenosha police. The New York Times reports that Blake admitted that he had a knife on him. However, as he tried to leave, officers opened fire, resulting in his horrible injuries.
This is really bad because this brings no justice to the family of the victims.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. And this also brings injustice to the criminal justice system as a whole.
Since we're fascinated with this topic of arrest, there's another case relating to how arrest is a problem with the Latino community. An article that's made by NBC explains how a Los Angeles handyman was arrested for his Latino appearance. He then was spent 2 months in a detention facility before heading a court hearing.
And wasn't this during the Trump administration was in office?
Yeah, actually, I believe this case took place in December of 2020.
From what I remember, this was back during 2019, 2020. Former President Trump had signed an executive order. He threatened the rights of immigrants and refugees. And the order had mentioned that they will detain and deport immigrants and refugees if they came into the U.S. illegally. And I think, for my personal experience or anecdote, at the time I was living in East LA, and East LA, it's predominantly Latino community, and going to grocery stores, it was pretty empty. So it had immigrants pretty scared that they would get deported if they had caught them at the grocery store.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, LA County sent out a statement saying that they will not enforce Trump's executive order and will not arrest or deport any immigrants that reside in LA County. But despite this, there's also stories like this one right here. The LA Times mentioned that a naturalized citizen was detained by ICE officers for over 1,200 days.
No, yeah, that's actually awful. I feel that 1,200 days, and it's just harsh punishment that no one should go through.
And this is apparently a common issue with ICE that results in legal trouble for nothing. But this issue that if we're looking into this, it's only really prevalent with Latin American immigrants. And I feel that this is due to the stigma that political figures have put on Latin American immigrants. We never really view European immigrants in such a bad light as for what political figures do with Latin American immigrants or Middle Eastern immigrants. Completely different.
Yeah,
so I feel it's
agree.
important to talk about. Yeah. Anyways, it looks like we are out of time for this topic. Yeah, we'll move on to the next one.
All right, so now I'm going to be talking about a poker game analogy that describes the unfair advantage that whites have been carrying through numerous decades compared to African Americans, as Roy L. Brooks describes in his article. So just a little preview on Roy L. Brooks. He is currently a professor of law at San Diego State University, and he is known for his literature, and he writes in the areas of legal and critical theory, civil procedure, civil rights, employment discrimination, and international human rights. So in his article, poker analogy goes like this. So 2 persons, one white, the other black, are playing a game of poker. The game has been in progress for almost 400 years. One player, the white one, has been cheating during much of this time, but now announces, from this day forward, there will be a new game with new players and no more cheating. Hopeful but somewhat suspicious, the black player responds, "That's great. I've been wanting to hear you say that for 400 years, actually. Let me ask you, what are you going to do with all those poker chips that you have stacked up on your side of the table all these years?" "Well," says the white player, somewhat bewildered by the question, "I'm going to keep them for the next generation of white players, of course." Some 30 years after the cheating stopped the passage of civil rights legislation, the racialized distribution of the poker chips, which resemble power, wealth, and privilege, continues to limit opportunities for Black Americans. These assets, often invisible, are passed down intergenerationally. Indeed, some economists estimate that up to 80% of lifetime wealth accumulation results from gifts from earlier generations, ranging from the down payment on a home to a bequest by a parent. Thus, power, wealth, and privilege are more than just comforts or indulgences. They create the starting point for the next generation. When power, wealth, and privilege are racialized, the starting point for each succeeding generation is necessarily racialized. It is no wonder that the typical white family enjoys a net worth that is more than 8 times that of its Black counterpart. So basically, from this passage, in other words, whites overall have accumulated the most resources that allow them to live comfortably. In my interpretation of this, the whites don't necessarily share these resources amongst other races, which is why we see major wealth disparities between whites and every other race, whereas African Americans and other ethnic communities had to essentially start from scratch and work their way up the social ladder.
And this is a perfect topic to like transition into, because I feel a lot of, as you said, a lot of wealth from white families is handed out throughout multiple generations. So I feel this is a perfect time for us to transition to talk about racial disparities between African American and white communities. This brings us to our final topic of racial disparities between African Americans and whites, specifically wealth in terms of wealth inequality. However, this topic is not limited to other things like health and other crucial living conditions.
Yes, I agree. And, socioeconomic status deeply impacts one's life.
Exactly, and especially in America, I think that everyone's socioeconomic status is what quote unquote defines a person in today's society.
And just unfortunately is also affected by race.
Yes, historically, African Americans and other people of color have been affected by things like hiring disparities, redlining, segregation, and wage gaps. Additionally, data reporting from the Federal Reserve in 1990 reveals that over 90% of the country's household wealth was controlled by whites. Additionally, African American households only accounted for 3.8% of household wealth in America, and this number is even smaller for Latinos at 2.1%.
Wow, yeah, that's truly shocking.
And it's also now important to note that while whites only control 85.5% of household wealth, this amount is still extremely disproportionate to blacks by only controlling 4.2% of household wealth. And if you need to get a better visual, the sheer amount of disparity between the two races, the average net worth of white Americans is roughly $437,000 per year, compared to nearly $105,000 for African Americans. And this number is even smaller for Latinos at $51,000 a year.
And is it just like the income that creates this racial divide?
Well, it's a whole bunch of other factors. Due to the fact people of color earn less than whites, this subjects them to living conditions that differ greatly from whites. This can range from neighborhood to food supply to schools to even medical care in some cases. So just talking about neighborhoods, redlining was a historic and popular way of discrimination against people of color. And if you didn't know what redlining was. Redlining was the process of withholding services from individuals due to them buying a house in a lower tier area, which was, you guessed it, was race and ethnic minorities determined the tier system. So if you were in a more densely populated area with African Americans, you would be in the lowest tier. And redlining eventually became this historic practice of denying mortgages in communities due to racial or ethnic composition. And this didn't factor in qualifications or creditworthiness. It was just race-based. And it's a prolific form of housing segregation that we see in America today, too.
And, we still see this today in areas like South Central LA that are predominantly African Americans and other ethnic minorities.
Yes, exactly. And due to the poor neighborhoods, these areas would tend to have lower performing schools, and areas that are predominantly African American and other ethnic minorities often deal with poverty or extreme poverty in some cases, leaving the area with food deserts. And if you didn't know what food deserts are places that are unable to provide sustainable food from a grocery store and whatnot. So higher poverty neighborhoods, you may see a lot more fast food restaurants or convenience stores just because they aren't able to afford a wholesome meal.
Right, and to put a local city as an example, our neighboring city, Lakewood, California, actually has been historically known to push away ethnic minorities and move the wealthy into single-family homes, while at the time, the only people who could actually afford it were primarily white people. So now, according to the lakewoodcity.org website's history section, it states, communities very much like Lakewood in the 1920s, when social reformers sought to get working class Americans out of the crowded tenements and ethnic ghettos of big cities and into single family homes. So Max, going back to the point that you were saying, essentially what you're trying to say is that America is still facing racial implications?
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. And personally, I'm unsure when we're going to really realize the long-term issues of systemic racism and be able to provide ways to overcome this.
I believe our generation can make an impact on how we can change our criminal justice system while also educating. Many people are posting information online about the issues that is happening around our countries. I believe that making a big difference can help on how we can change our country and make it as the safest place. These topics are very interesting and very important to talk about. Well, I'm afraid that it's all the time we have left for today's episode. Thank you to Max, Juan, and Alejandra for explaining the topics and their explanation. And also, thank you for those who are listening to our podcast, and I hope you can listen to our next podcast where we're going to talk about more problems that is related to our country.